definitely one of our favorite people to work with in the industry. So Jeremy, with all that flattery out of the way, I'm going to let you take the mic and give us your keynote here. Thanks so much for coming out and joining us.
Thank you, Patrick, and welcome everybody. For those in Canada, the US, on the West Coast, sorry it's so early. I hope you're enjoying your coffee. So I'm going to share my screen. So I'll aim to talk for about 45 minutes and then take some questions afterwards. So Ibogaine in the time of COVID. What are we talking about here? So I'll be giving a backdrop to the pandemic from my perspective. Then I'll be talking about the different lineages of Ibogaine in the US. And then finally, I'll be talking about the immediate pre-pandemic Ibogaine scene, where we are now, and then provide some glimpses as I see it into the future. The idea is to outline the key building blocks of the Ibogaine story in America and its dramatis personae, some of whom will be speaking today, with the key assumption that many listening in may be relatively unfamiliar with the molecule and its history. So while there's a significant backstory of Ibogaine research in France in the early to the mid-20th century, the theatre of action for Ibogaine has been focused on the US since the 1950s, as we shall see. I also want to use this presentation to give context to much of the discussion that will follow across the next 2 days, and to also make the point throughout that we cannot ignore the political dimension to Iboga and Ibogaine that's been present throughout its history. If we are to learn from the past, we must acknowledge the politics of Ibogaine as much as its pharmacological detail. So, scaling the hidden normal. Before we delve into the Ibogaine's history in the US, let's start with a snapshot of our present moment. Regardless of its actual origins, whether zoonotic, man-made, or even panspermic, the COVID virus is a symptom of globalizing processes challenging planetary homeostasis, the age of the Anthropocene, where humans have a dominant influence on the environment and planetary systems. The virus could not have become a global pandemic without global flows of human carriers. It's these interconnections and the carbon-based energy infrastructure behind them which are putting so much pressure on planetary health. Chaotic circumstances, short-term horizons, perpetual crisis, disease, and an inadequate healthcare response has been the reality of most of the world's population for many decades. And this is directly linked either to ongoing capitalist exploitation in the historical context of slavery and colonialism, caste systems, or inequitable planned systems elsewhere. This is certainly the case in Gabon, the source origin of Iboga and Ibogaine, which was exploited both during the colonial period by the French, but has also been underdeveloped in the post-colonial aftermath, most notably in the case of the ELF affair, that's the petroleum company ELF, where petroleum profits from Gabonese oil funded French politics for decades and fueled mega corruption from the top in Gabon. So access to an affordable or free and high quality healthcare system is rare across human populations, and it's actually confined to a few regions of the planet: Europe, Scandinavia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, Israel, and Cuba, to name a few places. And even where there is affordable access, there are often significant class and racial disparities in the quality of treatment. So what we are seeing with the most often inadequate response to the virus is a scaling up into enclaves of privilege, what most of the world's population was already experiencing. So it should go without saying that unless there is a dramatic shift towards political consensus and a much lighter carbon footprint across the planet, we're likely to see something far worse than COVID-19 with climate change in the next few years. So let's go into it. Before exploring the history of Ibogaine in the US, let's start with the source code. Bwiti is a set of communities of spiritual practice, mainly in Gabon, that use Iboga as sacrament as part of an initiation or therapeutic process. Knowledge of Iboga as a sacrament passed to the Fong ethnic group, which are Bantu-based, from forest-dwelling pygmies in the past few centuries. There's evidence that Iboga has been used as sacrament among these forest-dwelling communities for many thousands of years. As with Yage and ayahuasca, the discovery of these spiritual technologies in the West is wrapped up in the colonial project and the extraction of natural resources. Were it not for logging and the search for rubber and other natural resources, these practices would have remained hidden. Note the link between Gabon and Brazil in terms of geological fit. Millions of years ago, equatorial West Africa and Brazil were actually one landmass, as a parallel between the Yage and Iboga experience. So Ibogaine was first isolated from the shrub Tabernanthe iboga in France in the early 20th century. Ibogaine in a low or microdose tablet form was used as a tonic or stimulant in France from the 1930s to the 1960s and sold under the Lamborghini brand. Bwiti culture has been under threat thanks to the biopiracy of iboga, making the sacred wood sometimes prohibitively expensive in Gabon itself. Although currently on a smaller scale than the Amazon basin, Westerners are drawn to visit Gabon to undergo Bwiti initiation in search of ritual and a sacred healing experience. There'll be a panel on therapy in an indigenous context at 9 a.m. tomorrow, and also the talk after that at 10 a.m. tomorrow, this is Eastern time, on Ibogaine and the Nagoya Protocol with Yann Guignon, David Nassim, and Paul Amond Mombe Ndake. Outside the urgent issue of theft of a natural and cultural resource, the spiritual question to ask between the West and Bwiti is this: what happens to mental health within cultures which collectively become de-ritualized and lose relationship to community and initiation processes, elder authority structures, and so on? What happens to human communities that lose a relationship to the environment, to rivers and to forests? Can what has been lost be found in part through Bwiti? Okay, on to America. So it all begins with Harris Isbell. In 1955, Dr. Isbell used Ibogaine on 8 already detoxed African-American prisoners at the NIMH Addiction Research Center, ARC, in Lexington, Kentucky, funded by the CIA's MKUltra program. Isbell was interested in comparing Ibogaine's effects with LSD, which was the main interest from the CIA. ARC was part of the huge narcotics farm complex, which had space for 1,000 patients and was known locally as NARCO, or the farm, which is foundational in understanding addiction treatment in the US. Methadone, for example, was advanced here, as was the disease model of addiction that is now the status quo paradigm of our time. The writer William S. Burroughs remarked that the meals at the farm were excellent. Other guests included Sonny Rollins, Chet Baker, and Elvin Jones, to those jazz fans out there. Alas, there's no recording of the music they made while they were staying at the farm. Ethical standards, such as informed consent at ARC, were far from what we would expect today. Subjects were paid for their participation with their preferred drugs, usually opiates, and it was not uncommon to re-addict patients in order to continue with the experiments. In one notorious CIA-funded experiment with LSD, prisoners were given LSD on 77 consecutive days. That said, it would be a mistake to view Isbell as a black and white, cardboard cutout Cold War figure, sacrificing values and ethics for the search for a Manchurian candidate truth serum at Langley's behest. There were many progressive aspects of the research and the researchers at the farm and at the Addiction Research Center. For example, in 1951, Isbell testified to Congress that, quotes, "Smoking marijuana has no unpleasant after effects, no dependence is developed on the drug, and the practice can easily be stopped at any time." Finally, ARC was the immediate precursor institution to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, which formed in 1974. Now I'm going to play a video based at ARC.
Within the same complex at Lexington is another center. This one engaged in addiction research. Its mission is to investigate the nature of the drugs themselves. Our understanding of the scientific working of drugs, their physical effects on people, what changes they cause in the body, are questions to which we have few precise answers.
Have another one? Sure. Yeah, why not?
That's free.
Yeah, government's paying for it.
Patients from the Clinical Research Center volunteer for a variety of tests involving the actual intake of drugs. To the outsider, these tests may appear meaningless, and from a conservative point of view, immoral. However, they bring us closer to a clearer understanding of the chemical relationship between body and the agent. Whether the agent is marijuana, a marijuana cigarette, a synthetic drug, or one of the opiates.
I gave it wrong.
Highly sophisticated equipment measures the concentration of drug molecules within the body. This enables the researcher to compare what he sees in human behavior with what the instrument reveals the drug is doing to the body's organs, tissues, and chemistry. Through experiments such as the Addiction Center has racked, while Lexington's outpost in the wilderness of drug research was amassing information on the addict and on the drug, little else in the country was being done. Within this,
I'm not sure if you can hear those tones. I don't know what that's about, but I shall carry on. So just 7 years after Isbell's Ibogaine experiments, in 1962, a 19-year-old in New York, Howard Lotsof, we see pictured here, independently discovered its anti-addictive properties after a detour through film studies and filmmaking from the 1980s onwards, promoted its medicalization up until his death in 2010. Dana Beal will be presenting last at the conference and was a long-time supporter of Lotsof and Ibogaine advocacy in the US in general. Let's hear from Howard now.
I was having breakfast with a friend of mine who was a chemist, and he was going through a freezer he had, and the freezer was full of different types of drugs. He pulled out a small vial and said, I think you'll be interested in this. I said, well, what is it? He said, well, it's an African hallucinogen and it lasts 36 hours. So here I am under the influence of this very powerful hallucinogen. And I get home and I lay down, and the Ibogaine is working and working and working and working. And it's 33 hours later, and I only thought to myself, I'm exhausted, I'm going to sleep for a week, and I'm never going to take this drug again. And I got dressed and I walked out of the house, and that's when I realized that I was not in narcotic withdrawal. And I looked at this large tree in front of me, and I looked at the clouds in the sky, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I was not frightened, and perceived that my entire life had been full of fear. Now, imagine that you are a doctor. You spend 12 years getting your education. You spend 15 years in the field becoming an expert. And then the last thing you're going to want to hear is some former heroin addict went and discovered the effective medication that you're looking for. So there was enormous resistance. When you're an addict and suddenly are not an addict, that's a very valuable experience. And I observed how poorly treated addicts are in our society. And I wanted to do something with my life. And the most important thing that I could perceive of doing was producing Ibogaine as an available medically approved drug. And that's what drove me.
So onwards with the show. So in the early 1990s, Howard Lotsof contacted Professor Stanley Glick, who's now Professor Emeritus at Albany Medical College, who, although initially skeptical, was eventually persuaded to start studying Ibogaine in the 1990s with rats. He went on to develop a synthetic version of Ibogaine, 18MC. This second-generation molecule is now undergoing clinical trials in Australia, sponsored by MindMed. Lotsof also introduced Dr. Deborah Mash to Ibogaine in 1991, and they teamed up to prepare for clinical trials. Lotsof Company, NDA International, partnered with the University of Miami. Preparation for NIDA-funded phase 1 trials under her leadership began in 1993, beginning with dose escalation studies. However, NIDA appeared to be acquiring cold feet on Ibogaine research. In 1995, the then head of the Medications Development Division of NIDA, Frank Bwiti, convened an expert panel of consultants to determine whether NIDA should continue investigating Ibogaine. Although opinion was divided on this panel, ultimately the ruling was to go against any further research and close down the project. Ultimately, clinical trials with Ibogaine were discontinued at that time due to funding issues. Lotsof and Mash then fell out in 1996 due to a patent dispute. It's not clear if the argument against Ibogaine at the time was purely for scientific reasons and the cardio-neurotoxicity of Ibogaine, or also for other reasons. At the time, Stanley Glick said, quotes, "NIDA has totally backed away from Ibogaine. There's no question that there's a political barrier. Why it's there, I really don't understand, but I received advice from people I know at NIDA who are acting in my best interest, advising me to work on something else." It may be more than coincidence that this period coincides with the approval of oxycodone, developed by Purdue Pharma, at the very outset of the opioid crisis,